Well, today I'm just pottering about a bit. It's good to vary things a bit. Can't weld all the time. It gets pretty tedious in the end. I wouldn't like to do it as a job every single day. Making a few switches up for the dashboard. Although these are super rugged military type switches, it's good to just test they work. So this is going to be my instruments power. When you flick it, turns the dashboard on basically. So people are quite scared sometimes of electrical stuff, but really it's not. In terms of car stuff, it's not too difficult. Just think of it, I know purists would go crazy, but just think of it as water flowing through pipes from plus to back to the minus if you want. That's one way of thinking about it. You can put a whole fuse board in, but the wiring on this car is really simple. So you can get these, you can buy them. In fact, I'll show you one unmolested. It comes like that. Basically, you cut this wire, and this is a holder for a fuse. And it takes a blade type fuse, so I've put one here. So my water's flowing into my switch, and when I turn it on, it flows back out. And if we open this, you can see I've got a fuse in there, and it's actually 5 amp, which is a bit on the high side because I'm only running some instruments, so maybe I'll drop that to a 3. And these plug in, and you can buy them quite cheaply. Obviously you buy a few in case you've got some spares, and it's got this little waterproof container, and that's one way to do it. And I solder the wires on using a normal soldering iron. Again, these aren't that expensive, maybe, I don't know, $15, something like that, 20 for a reasonably nice one. I've got one with a fairly small end on it. You can get enormous ones. How many watts is that? That's 18 watts. It's about right. For thick wire, the really thick wire, that's pushing it. You might need to go up to say 30. Some are adjustable in power, but then you have a little sort of base unit then with the soldering iron coming off it. But for most regular soldering, the 18 watt, 20 watts is fine. A bit bigger if you're doing really thick wire. But I'd say this is it. These are for instruments, so I'm not using thick wire. So that's one way to do it. Before I put the switches in, I test them, because these, although they're like mega well made, they're a bit old. They're from 1950s or something. So basic multimeter. See, there's one there. There's a little horseshoe shaped thing. That's ohms, which is resistance. So we'll click it to that, and you can press the function button. They all vary, but they roughly work like this. Right, see that little thing appeared there? If you can see that, that means when there's no resistance at all to the flow of electrons or water, if it's easy to think of it like that, between the two wires, then it'll beep. Right, hear it beep. Right, so hopefully, if I connect one wire to one end of my switch, and one wire, yeah, this is where you run out of fingers, to the other one. So that switch, right, so we know that switch works, and we know that down is on. So I'm going to mark the top with a little black dot, so I remember that. So the dot is at the top, right? There we are, black dot. That's the top. Down is on. Nice. So there you go. I've put the switch back in. That's power to my instrument system. This one we power to that turns on the whole car ignition system, and then that's the starter button. So I'm just wiring up this voltmeter. So I've tinned these with the soldering iron, these ends. It just strengthens them a bit. Get these bits off. label everything, that's the other tip. And honestly, go on eBay, you don't have to be a surgeon. Surgeon's forceps, surgical forceps, just Google that. You can hold wires with them, you can reach down with a nut in the end and do it up with a screwdriver. They lock, self-lock, well that one did, there we are. And they come in, this is a long reach one if you want to really reach down somewhere. Really, really useful. So here I'm using them as weak pliers, for example. So I'm just going to squeeze that together like that. Bring it around, there we are. And then put it all back together. These just save you so much time when you're doing that fiddly bolts, fiddly nuts you can't quite reach. So, oh, there it goes. I've now got a black ground wire which I've got to connect to the chassis because the chassis is the ground. In other words, the negative of the battery is connected to the chassis and the chassis acts as the ground for all the circuits, most of them. So I'm using one of these ring connectors and they're meant to be crimped on, but I don't trust that. I actually file them both sides. I run the wire through, bend it around the side and solder it, crimp it, and then sort of melt solder in to where the crimp is. So even if it corrodes a bit, it should still work. Okay, so there we are. I've just been working on this central dashboard switch, the push button ignition switch with this big knob thing on it that goes there. So if we turn to the back, this little ring comes off and then you're left with a whole load of contacts. So I've just been round with a meter, a multimeter. I found two of them that when the button's pressed they're connected together and they're numbered, and it's actually 1 and 5. So I very neatly, very carefully done them up like that, and then instead of bringing it out through the back, because there's a piece of metal behind it, I've brought it out through the side. So I've filed a little piece out there and that will go on there, see, and then it'll be nice and neat. You're probably wondering what I'm doing now. Why have I got a laptop connected to my dashboard? Well, if you remember this temperature gauge, the dual, hang on, if I turn the wheel, the dual temperature gauge there, you can see the needles twitching. They have a little computer in the back, if you remember, which I calibrated to some sensors which go into the block here, and there's one on the other side. So this is unusual in that it's a double temperature sensor. So the problem I had was the sensors I bought had the wrong thread. So I've now got these sensors with the wider thread, you see, and I'm going to test them. So I've got a pan, I'm going to fill it with boiling water. I've got a jug of cold water. I can then keep adding to the boiling water to bring the temperature down, and I've got albeit a cheap, but it is reasonably accurate, digital thermometer. It's designed for sticking into meat. So I'm going to boil the kettle, fill this up, and then write down the temperatures coming out of the sensors as the temperature then slowly cools. That's the plan anyway. Right, I've got a whole scientific experiment planned out here now. So to go through it for you, hang on, oops, try and hold the camera still, if I can. Right, here we go. So we've got our instruments, but we're looking at this one in particular, the double temperature gauge. We've got the 2 temperature sensors in a kettle that's currently at room temperature, but it's plugged in ready to go. So if I flick the switch on the kettle, I can bring it up in roughly 10-20 degree bursts. I can check the temperature with my incredibly accurate $4 meat temperature probe, which actually is about right, surprisingly, because it was so cheap. Got it running now from the whole lot. It's an instrument test really. Got it running from the battery. So the ground is connected to the frame here, and then the live wire, this one, will be vice gripped to this post, and that runs through a fuse here, very important, through this switch. Flick switch, turns on all the instruments, and if I've got a short circuit, hopefully the fuse will blow. The only instruments that are actually attached to anything are the temperature sensors. So what should happen is I can bring up the temperature, check that what's on the gauge is similar to what I'm reading on this when I put the probe, hang on, it's for sticking into meat really, this sensor. If I put the probe into the kettle of water, I can roughly, bearing in mind that these take a little while to reach the same temperature as the actual water, there's a bit of a lag time before they settle down, but hopefully I'll get a roughly similar reading on here to the temperature probe when I stick it in the water, so that's good. When it hits 90, I can't remember how I've done it, I wired it actually, but at least one of these lights should come on, and I think it flashes, I can't remember. So that's my warning that the engine's getting a bit hot if it goes above 90. I'll put on the screen what that is in Fahrenheit for American viewers, but 100 is boiling point of water. So 90 is your warning, especially as by the time this is reading 90, these sensors are reading 90, it's probably going to be 94, because there's a lag. If the temperature's climbing rapidly, they'll lag behind just a touch. So 90 seems a good point to have a warning light. So the first thing is to do what Derek Bieri would call the sniff test, which is you connect up your battery and then smell around here for burning wire and melting plastic, because you've got a short circuit somewhere. But as I say, the wire comes in through a fuse, so hopefully that'll just go bang if there's a wiring mistake on my part. Okay. Right, nothing will happen on the instruments yet because I've not turned them on. So now I'm going to flick the power switch, and then we'll see what happens now. So here we go. Oh, I'm nervous. No wonder there was no spark. Okay. Right. Oh, all right. We've got. This is just the self-test. Right, these are zeroed. RPM is, well, I'm almost at 0. I've got voltmeters reading. Now you remember it's not quite right, the scale, because I replaced the internals but kept the gauge. But basically 12 volts, look. I'll measure it with the multimeter, but whatever this battery is, it's probably a bit more than 12. So a normal voltage is just below the red, so I can remember that. It's quite easy. Just below the red is basically normal. I'll need to mark off where maybe 11.8 is, because if you're below 11.8 then something wrong with your battery, you're probably not charging. So I'm probably going to have some cheat marks on this dial, a couple of little dots, just to remind me what's good and what's bad. So now I'll turn on the kettle and this should start to rise. Here we go, kettle on, go. Right. I'll bring it up to about 35 and then flick it off. Nothing's moving yet on the gauges. No, not moved yet. Oh, starting to move. Hey, look at this, look. Starting to move. Tiny bit. See them moving? Well, that's reading 33, 34. And what are these reading? Yeah, they're about right. Yeah, they're about 30, aren't they? Well. Why am I always surprised when something actually works as I planned it? I might just stop at 50 for a little bit. Where are we now? 48? Yeah, 50. Right, I've got 50 on here, so I'm going to cut the power. Whoops, running out of hands. Right, just leave it at 50 a minute. Now, because there's less mass in this, it responds a lot faster than the relatively heavy sensors there. So actually, look, you see, it's more 57. So where are we on here? All right, we're around 50, aren't we? Right, it's properly boiling. Yeah. Right, okay. Should have had some flashing warning lights actually by now, but we haven't. Now the other thing, I got the software in the gauge set to turn on the warning lights at 110, so I've changed it to 90, so it might actually work now. So the next step is to turn on the kettle, bring it up to 90. Let's see what happens. So I've actually got 92 on the computer coming out of the gauge. I've got, just give that a minute to settle there. I've just dipped that in. Got the warning light on, which should get my attention, and then we've got the gauges sitting around 90. So it'll be interesting to see what temperature this light goes out at. It should, as soon as it's showing 96 now on the it takes a while, doesn't it, for everything to reach equilibrium.